Hi, I'm Bill,
And I'm Sherry.
and this is another BS production. And today we are talking about what gets measured gets done.
That's an exciting one. So, the first thing we talk about is your mindset around measurement. And so, people have one or two mindsets. Usually, it's pretty ingrained. They either believe that anything can be measured, or they definitely believe that some things cannot be measured. And that's it. When you talk to them about their job or what they're doing, they'll say it can't be measured. It's not possible. Or absolutely, let's figure the measurements out. So, which are you?
I think you can measure anything. And I think if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And I've worked in a lot of places and I've consulted a lot of places where people told me how complex and sophisticated and, interstellar their job was, that it was impossible to track and measure their performance. And at the end of the day, I got to call BS. I got to call Bill and Sherry on that and say, no, you can measure anything. If you have the right expectations set, you can measure just about anything.
And that's, I think, what you'll find at the end of this presentation that we talk about is it's really about what were those expectations and finding out from somebody, what did you expect me to do? And then that will help. So we're going to talk about what measurements exist for you right now. We're going to break it down into 4 W's because we think that's fun. And who's looking at your measurements? So who's looking at what are you responsible for? So what are those expectations and how is your performance measured? It's exciting stuff, huh?
It's fascinating, and it's the key to a lot of things in your business. And it's the key to your productivity, it's the key to your success, and it's the key to happy performers or happy employees.
And it's also the key to celebrations.
Yes. And so, on that topic, where we like to start is where you want to end up, which is you want to have smarter goals or smarter expectations for your employees. So, what does that mean? Um, well, we've taken that acronym SMART, and you guys might be familiar with it: specific, measurable, agreed upon, realistic, and time sensitive. And we've made it smarter. So we've said, in addition to that, you need to have excitement around or encouragement around the goal. And you also need to have reinforcement around it. You need to have what happens to me when I get it done, right? What happens? What are the good, positive things that happen to me when I get it done? So smarter goals and having those expectations set to beginning, because if you don't decide where you want to end up, what's the old saying? If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Well, you don't want to be on the road that puts you in a ditch or the middle of the woods, right? So you want to get on the right road.
And if you're not familiar with Smarter Goals, if you have the Earn Method book, they're on page 68, so you probably haven't gotten there yet. And I will make a handout and put it on the download page of Positive Impact Force so you can get familiar with them, because you definitely want to be familiar with Smarter Goals when you look at what you're measuring, how you're measuring it, and when you're measuring it.
So Sherry's buddy, Peter Drucker,
I
says,
love him.
what gets measured gets managed.
He says a lot of smart things, but this is a good one, don't you think?
Yeah, and if you can't measure it, I say if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, right?
Right.
So how would you know if you don't have measurements? How do you know what's happening is what you want to happen? Um, so Sherry's going to tell you about the 4 W's of accountability.
So it's really who's working on the task. So is it you? Are you doing it with other people? Are there things that are happening upstream and downstream? So you really want to look at who it is and how do you fit into that and how do you fit into the measurement? Because if somebody is measuring an entire process and you're only one piece of it, it's very, very difficult for you to know how your performance is being rated. And so when you break that down, if you could look at what specifically is being measured in the task and what specifically you're doing. So you'll have like your piece of what that is. So you know who and what, and then you just need to know when the measurements occur. Like, are they doing it right away or is it way past when you complete the process. So you want to know when in your process it's happening. And then WHIDDI, my favorite, witty. And so that's what happens if I do it, or what happens if I don't do it.
Yep, and the proximity, we talk about the when of the measurement. The proximity of the measurement to the actual performance of the behavior, the closer it is, the better likelihood you will have of reinforcing and shaping the behavior that you want.
When I think we're going to talk about, because I think we'll talk about each one of these a little bit more, right?
But
yeah.
I wanted to say that.
Okay.
In case I forgot, Sherry, because I'm old and I don't remember all these things like you do, because you're so young and so full of energy. So
well, you're my favorite person today then.
Yeah, whatever. Oh, go ahead and talk about who's working on it.
Well, this is important because you don't work in a vacuum. And so a lot of the places where I work on measurements, there's other people involved. And so we use the example of like assistants. Oftentimes they say like, I can't measure my job because I never know what I'm going to do, right? Every single day I'm asked to do different tasks. And so when we have it breaking down, we say, who's working on the task? If you're doing the task, we can measure it. If you're doing the task with someone else, then we need to look at what your piece is. So who's working on the task is just knowing what pieces you're working on, which really is what pieces do you have control over? Because if you have control over those pieces, then we can look at how to measure them.
So the next part is what specifically, and that's the S in the SMART, is being measured.
Right.
So if you're the performer, you're the employee, ask how your work will be measured. You should know that. Ask how those measurements are recorded, because we want to make sure the source of the measurement is accurate. Sometimes they may be using data that doesn't align with what your activity is. So you need to make sure that the source of those measurements and how they're recorded is very accurate, and it speaks to what the performance is. And the final thing is you should understand how to monitor your own results. So you can give yourself feedback throughout the process, so you don't have to wait for others to do it.
Right. Your performance should never be a surprise to you. You should be able to know exactly how you're doing and how other people think you're doing. Exactly. Yeah. So when do the measurements occur? And this is really, really important. And Bill talked a little bit about this earlier, but you want to understand what's being measured when, because if you're going to say like, hey, on your performance 2 weeks ago, this, and this, I'm not going to remember. Like, would you remember if somebody came back to you? Or things could change upstream that affects what happened in your performance. So the win really needs to be immediate.
As close to the result or the performance as possible. It's the old,
and not necessarily the result, but the performance, right? Because the result could be the result of the whole.
Well, I'm talking about the result of that particular behavior.
Of that task, yeah.
The whole process. It's the old story about, closing the barn door after the horses have run,
Right.
You want to make sure the horses aren't in another county, right? You want to make sure you keep them in the yard and get them back in the barn.
Yep.
So this is your favorite.
I don't think that's a story everybody knows, but okay, we'll go with that. So what happens, I'm going to get to do the fun part.
Grow up on a farm.
If I do it. And so actually Bill likes to talk about that. So I'm going to talk about what happens if I don't do it, and I'll let you talk about if I do it. Yeah. Because we want to talk about positive reinforcement and how to increase behavior through measurements. But I also want to tell you that a lot of times when I go in to talk to managers and they say that a certain behavior isn't happening, and so they'll hire me because they want this behavior to happen. The first thing I ask is what happens if they don't do it? Because if nothing happens, then you have nothing in place to drive the behavior. And so we really work with managers and organizations to have these positive reinforcements in place so that when somebody does the behavior, they're positively reinforced for it so they continue to do it again. And if they're doing something that you want to stop, like we talked about this in our ABC of behavior, but if they have a behavior that you absolutely don't want to have in your organization, then we want to put a negative consequence. And so what happens if they do it is that it stops. And so you really want to look at what are the consequences and the reinforcers. And so you want to talk about the positive one?
Well, just a little more on that. If nobody cares and nobody bothers about whatever the performance or the measurement is, let's say a measurement gets produced and nobody looks at it and nobody cares, then you're probably not measuring the right thing, right? So what I'm more focused on is what happens if I do it and I do it right. What's the outcome? What's the benefit to me as the performer or the employee? What's the benefit to the business? What's the benefit to the recipient of whatever performance or behavior I'm eliciting? So that is where, as a manager, you would look at, say, well, how can I reinforce that? Because in business, any business, you look around at what's happening, what you're getting is what's getting reinforced, right? So when you're starting to pinpoint what you're going to measure, you got to be real specific and know that those things are the important things and the measurements align with whatever those behaviors are.
And I'm going to add, if you're making any changes in your process, you want to make sure that you've changed your measurements so that you're not measuring what you used to want as a result. So I give an example of when companies add a process, like in a call center, you might measure somebody on the number of calls they take, how long their percentage of being available. So their percentage of availability, which means they're just waiting for the next call, but they're available to take it, and their quality. And so if you add upselling to that process, then that might take longer. So you might need to change your measurements, because you don't want to measure somebody on how many calls they take per hour and then ask them to do a process that's going to require them to take fewer calls, because they're not going to do it. They're going to do whatever it is that you measure. So when you make changes, make sure you go back and look at the measurements that you have in place and that you've changed them, so that what happens if they do it is they're positively reinforced. Because I see that happen a lot, is the measurements stay the same, but the work changes.
I've worked in collections early in my career, and I took over one particular department, and a lot of the metrics centered around how many calls were made in a day. And obviously there's a correlation between making a phone call or making contact with somebody and collecting money. But if you're only focused on how many contacts you made and you're not focused on the quality of that contact and what that contact produced, guess what happened in that organization? They only focused on the amount of calls. So people would try to get as many calls in as possible. The discussions were very short and the results were abysmal, because they basically said, look, I made my quota, I made the calls. Yeah, but the calls didn't translate into the results that they were looking for. So we said, yeah, there's a progression. You got to make the calls. The calls have to be meaningful. And, then you start figuring out, well, how long is a meaningful call, right? What's the average time for a meaningful call versus one that's just like a BS call, right? And then what should that produce? What percentage of the amounts that you were going after should you have collected? And then start setting those benchmarks and moving those measurements up, and then giving that feedback in real time on a regular basis. All that's important to focusing on the right behavior that you're trying to get. And that put that department in a complete tizzy, because their behavior before was just how many calls I could make. It could be, hello, is this Mrs. Smith? Okay, good to talk to you. Could you please make your payment? Goodbye. Not, hey, what's going on? How can we figure this out? We do this every month. You're still behind. Those kind of things that get to a meaningful conclusion.
So how can you track it? You could use a system, a spreadsheet. You could use tally marks and have people do it themselves. You can let them know their productivity. So really, how you track it depends on what systems or resources you have. And so if you don't have any systems or resources, then I would start with, what do you have available?
So, usually if you have a database of some sort, you can get several types of reports, right? You can get um, measurements or reports that tell you what needs to be done. You can see what got done, and you can see what didn't get done. Those are just three categories of, measurements of activities for any particular task. So again, picking the right things to measure, making sure your source data is correct, very important. And I like manual scorekeeping to some extent because it keeps the person engaged, and it also gives you a sense of internal reinforcement that you got something done.
And it allows people to celebrate. I'm a big fan of celebrating your success.
That's right. So we created this handy dandy little measurement tracking worksheet. And what we suggest you do is do it right now in whatever you do. Make a list of what's getting measured. Figure out what the source is of that measurement. Is it somebody keeping a tick on their page? Is it a report from a database? Is it a survey result? Who owns the measurement? So where's it coming from? Who's responsible for creating it? How frequently is it created? Is there a deadline for it? And at the end of the day, who gets it? And I think the most important part of this is what benefit is there to the person who gets the report or the measurement, right? Because if there's no benefit, then chances are you're not measuring the right thing. And I'll give you an example of when back in the collection days, I took over a department. I would go the first month, just kind of watch and observe the behaviors. I observed the calls that, weren't productive and all those things. And then I noticed the last couple of days of the month, there weren't a lot of calls being made because everybody's working on a report that they were going to produce to the CFO that was due the second business day of the month on what the results were from the previous month. And they were doing a lot of it manually. And so I watch this behavior, and I see this behavior the last 2 days of the month. People aren't making calls. They're counting and reporting what they've done. Well, the last couple of days of the month are your most important days to get funds in. So I was like, okay, let me, when this report gets produced, I want to take it to the CFO, and I want to ask him, what are you doing with this data? And how is this, benefiting anybody, and how is it benefiting you? And so I'll never forget, I was on that job. It was like my 30th day. I'd been there for a month. The guy that I was giving it to had hired me. He was the CFO. He'd been there 8 months. So he was new. And so I went into his office and I said, Ralph, I'm here to bring you the report from collections, and I just want a few questions about this report and what you use it for. And he looked me square in the eye and he said, I've been wondering about that, because ever since I've been here, they bring it to me every month, like on the first of the month, and I really haven't had a chance to even look at it or even understand what it does. So what I do is I put it on the back of my credenza, and I usually throw out the one from the month before because I really don't need that anymore. And I figure I'll get to it eventually. And I was like, Ralph, did you realize we were taking the entire collection department to its knees for 2 days at the end of the month to produce this for you? And I said, I would, with all, if I can, I'd just like to stop. He's like, sure. You get whatever measurements you need to figure out how to run your department. I don't know why the hell they're doing this. And so that's just an example of, we had everybody focused on a behavior, on producing a metric and delivering it to somebody who didn't even want
it. And so when we originally developed this sheet, it was for employees to understand. So when you're working with your boss, it's really important for you to understand what they're measuring and how they're getting that measurement and what the benefit is to the recipient. Because if the actual employee doing the job understands the benefit to the recipient that's receiving it, then guess what happens on the measurement piece? They can give you really great feedback on how they are benefiting that recipient and what should and can be measured, and you can get great feedback. But if you're a manager, you want to make sure that you have this information so that you can share it with your employee. So really, this will benefit everybody in the organization, but I really recommend that employees do it And if you're a good manager, you could just give it to your employees and ask them to fill it out to make sure that you've communicated that information. That's what I think.
I think that's a good plan.
All right, so let's recap, because it's my favorite part of what we talked about today. So you're going to know when the measurements happen, like, and for the work that you do, you're going to determine who's doing the work that's getting measured and what you're measuring for each person. You're going to know specifically what's being measured, identify what happens if you do it or if you don't do it, take responsibility for your performance, and make sure you understand the value to the recipient. And then what will happen?
Then you will get improvements in your processes. You'll have happier performers. And you should get the results that you're looking for. Because as Mr. Drucker says, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it.
Absolutely. And I think that you'll get great feedback. People will be more engaged in what they're doing. They'll know why they're doing it. And so if you want to learn more, you can visit us at positiveimpactforce.com. We have some materials and downloads there that you can have. You can watch us on YouTube, which hopefully you're doing that right now. And you can follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Instagram, or you could read our book, the Earn Method book.
You can read the Earn Method. There's a lot of good stuff in there. And we're available. So if you want to contact us, you can send us an email. If you have a business problem or a question you're trying to solve and need some advice, give us an email and or visit us on our website, positiveimpactforce.com.
And if you have a specific topic you want us to cover, you can send us that too, and we will create a video on it.
We will.
All right. Well, thank you. It was good spending time with you.